Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. All right. So I apologize in advance if my voice is a little monotone, just getting over a cold. But welcome. That is where we are. Again, seasonally appropriate dhammas arising. And maybe you find yourself on a day like today and you're looking out the window and you're saying, the weather outside is frightful. But something in your head is speaking up and saying, well, don't you mean it's delightful? Don't you mean it's a winter wonderland? Aren't you, I mean, wouldn't the Buddhist perspective on this to be, oh, look, I have this wonderful day. It's freezing, it's raining, it's snowing, it's cold outside, and I have this day off. I can sit here, abide in my comfortable, warm dwelling place and practice the Noble Eightfold Path, develop these wonderful dhammas of liberation. And that voice says that in the back of your mind. And so you sit down in front of the window, you maybe wrap yourself in a blanket or something. And then as you close your eyes, you start to get comfortable. Maybe like many meditators throughout human history, your mind starts to drift a little, yeah? And it starts to maybe some of you are gardeners, and it's like, well, it's cold now, but anytime it's spring is going to be upon us, and it's going to be planting time. And I wonder what I want to plant in my garden this year. Oh, I've got to order the seeds, and I can plant this and I can plant that. And in your head, all of these grids start, laying themselves out in your imaginary garden. Before you know it, the morning is over, and you've planned it all out, and one thing led to the next, and you've got this wonderful imaginary garden, but none of the peace of Nibbana. I mean, you're more peaceful than you were. You weren't thinking about, war, famine, pestilence, and death, and all of the woes of the world. No, you were thinking about gardening. That's not so bad. But nevertheless, you feel like an opportunity was lost. You're like, what was that? It wasn't quite peaceful, but it wasn't. It was just kind of distracted. Or maybe you're sitting there and you're looking outside and you're thinking, oh, it's cold, but I'm warm enough in here. Then you're thinking, but it's just January. It's just January. There's still plenty of time for worse weather. There could be snowstorms and shoveling, and I could throw out my shoulder again from all the shoveling, and there's going to be salt all over everything. It's going to get all over the car, and yeah. Before you know it, the morning is gone, and you've been thinking, it's like, oh, I'm glad I'm not suffering now because there's a lot more winter to suffer over. Yeah, what was that? How did that happen? What was this process that just occurred where one thought, one feeling, one perception led to another, led to another, led to another? And this is kind of the thing that we wake up to when we first start to meditate, is that it's not simply about gross, wholesome or unwholesome states. It's not simply either we're generous or we're stingy. Either we're kind or we're hateful. Either we're awake and aware, or we're completely deluded and wandering about mumbling to ourselves. We find that there's a lot of gray area in between, and most of it is ruled over by a state of sort of quiet proliferation is the word that's used, but it's not quite the right word, but it does seem like something is growing, something is working, something is churning, something is developing under the surface. And this is what we're looking at today. a word papancha, which has been translated very popularly as mental proliferation. I say popularly because though it's a word that gets some press in modern meditation circles because it makes so much sense to us, right? We all know that we have papancha. The second we hear it, we're like, yes, yes. How do I stop that? It's just very loud. It just won't stop. But figuring out what it is and where it comes from, now that's a whole different kind of thing because it's very slippery. Yeah. To most of us, it probably seems like just the mind is restless. It just won't stop. And we're like, so where is it the hindrances, and where is it something that's not quite so overtly, destructive and distracting, but a more fundamental part of the mind that just doesn't want to be quiet. And so proliferation, the idea, the word means like bunny rabbits. It means like multiplying. It means growing in size or quantity. It means 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 16, 32, all of these multiples, yeah, exponents. But if we really look at our mind, that's kind of not what's happening, is it? Because we're only able to think one thought at a time. It seems like it's very crowded in here, but that's just the effect of not having any moments of peace and quiet. If we really look, we're only thinking of one thing at a time, but one thing seems to lead to the next thing. And so maybe a better word would be elaboration, because we get caught on a perception, we get caught on a feeling, we get caught on an idea, and our mind keeps churning on that, keeps trying to develop that and throwing more stuff at it to try to flesh it out. But if, again, we were just talking about this, is like proliferation is also not a terrible word. And moreover, it's the popular word. So I'm just going to cycle between papancha and proliferation, and we'll just work with that. Yeah. But to know that we're not talking about thoughts multiplying. We're talking about this process working under the surface that keeps one thought leading to the next, leading to the next. And then we're going to look at a couple of 2 little sutta snippets to maybe seed the mind. And the rest is up to you. Because my papancha is not causing you suffering. It's your papancha that's causing you suffering. So it's your papancha that's going to be under the microscope. But maybe with a little bit of context and a little bit of ideas to look at it, you might learn something about this papancha that you have, this papancha that's happening, yeah, and what it means. And more to the point, to help us all travel down this path of energy, of exertion, of practice, it will help us to understand the fundamental disease that we're trying to cure. Yeah, the real cause of our suffering. This papancha, though it's not the whole problem, it's just a facet of the problem. It's a really great diagnostic tool for knowing what's going on in our mind. Yeah, it's sort of like when we learn to notice it, it's like a little light that comes on our display panel and lets us know greed, hatred, and delusion are present. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we just had a little light that would pop up and say, hey, you're deluded? Then we would know that everything coming out of our mouth is not quite right. And maybe we would slow down a little and we'd stop, getting into arguments and fights and chasing after something. We'd be like, wait, the warning light is on. And this is what investigating papancha can do for us. It can be a great way to see that something's wrong before we feel the effects, the nasty consequences of our actions. Yeah. Okay. So before we get looking at the 2 little sutta snippets, because we don't have a ton of material to work with on papancha. Every meditator since the beginning of time has recognized that it's there, but describing it is like sort of, it's how do you do that? It's like describing time. well, one thing moves to the next thing, moves to the next thing. And you're like, how? You're like, I don't know. It just, time just happens, right? Again, Papañca kind of happens. Trying to describe it is almost counterintuitive. But maybe this example will help show kind of what we're working with here. So I thought you have a person wakes up one morning and they're stretching, and then they catch sight of their hand. Yeah, sorry, I'm working in reverse and backwards, but they see their hand. And unlike every previous morning, their hand is kind of blue. And they're looking at their hand, and their hand is blue, and that's not normal. And they decide, maybe I'm going to go see a doctor about this. So they go see the doctor, and the doctor picks up their hand and looks at it and shines a light at it, and looks at it with a little magnifying glass. And they say, your hand is blue. And the person's like, yes, we need to do something about this. And so the doctor reaches into their drawer and they pull out a tube of cream. And they're like, okay, well, I've carefully matched this to your situation. This should work. That person's like, great. What will this do? And they're like, well, it will change the color of your hand. It's a nice, I've matched it to your complexion. It's a kind of top coat. It's a makeup. Yeah. So you'll put it on and your hand will no longer be blue. It'll be back to the color it was. And the person says, that's great. And so they go home. And the next morning, not just their hands, but their toes are starting to turn blue, but they've got the cream. So they put the cream on their toes too. And now nothing's blue. And next day their ear is blue, but they've got the cream, and they put the cream on their hand and on their toes and on their ear. Problem solved, right? After all, they went to the doctor because their hand was blue. And they got something that treated the reason they went to the doctor. Problem solved, right? Well, this might be enough for some people, actually. And if we look out at what the Buddhists called Patujana, or worldly beings, we find that many of them are just trying to treat suffering. They're trying to treat the symptom of suffering, yeah? And this is when the Buddha talks about the first noble truth, we start to see a division between kinds of people. The Buddha says there is suffering in life. There is aging, sickness, and death. There is loss. There's grief, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, to be exact. The Buddha says this is a noble truth. It is a reality of our world. And you'll see this division. Some people will be like, is there a cream for this? Can I just, rub something on and it becomes bearable? And this is the ways of the world, yeah? But then the other side of people will look at their doctor and they'll be like, no, I know my hand is blue, but that obviously there's something making my hand blue. I don't just want to cover up this symptom. I think this is a symptom of some underlying condition, and I'd really like to know what it is. So maybe they get a second opinion, and the second doctor says, look, I got to be honest. I don't think this is the biggest problem, that your hand is blue. I think there's something much more serious at play. And so we're going to run some tests. And they do some investigation. They find the person's blood pressure is low. And then they investigate further, and they find they've got a heart arrhythmia. Their heart isn't beating right. And they say, okay, look, you've got low blood pressure. It's causing your fingers and toes and ears to change colors. I think the thing to do maybe to have a heart pacemaker put in, fix the problem with your heartbeat. And they do that. And even though the doctor did not treat the blue hand gets better because the blood pressure got better, because the heartbeat got better, right? And so would you say that the doctor went wrong by saying, look, forget about the blue hand. I'm not even going to bother treating that. That's not where the problem is coming from. Yeah, we need to treat the source of the problem. And so this is the second noble truth, as the Buddha describes it. He is like saying, look, understand suffering. Look at suffering, know suffering, see it in the world. Now, so that you stop reacting to the wrong thing. When it comes to the source of suffering, the cause of suffering, the actual disease, that is what you want to treat. That is what you want to abandon. So with Papañca, we're going to work with the understanding that papancha is a symptom. Yeah, it's built into the way that the mind works, namely that perceptions are hungry things. Yeah, a perception is an idea. It's a viewpoint. Yeah, it's a perspective on the world. We all have these, right? We all see things in a particular way. If you don't think you have an opinion, just pick up a newspaper and you will see very quickly, yes, you have opinions about a wide variety of topics. But what are the opinions? If you didn't know you had the opinion until you were presented with conflicting information that got you all angry, does the opinion actually exist until you come in contact with that thing? And this is part of how perceptions are built. Since they don't have their own form, they borrow the form of other things. Yeah, it's just an idea. It's a nebulous concept until you have things to reinforce it with. And so there's this part of the mind that the Buddha refers to as Papañca, Sañña, Sankha. And this is where one of the ways that we find the word Papañca used in the Pāli Canon, and it's literally the Papañca that builds Saññas. It is the mind proliferating or elaborating in order to develop a perception. And when we look in meditation, this is what we're going to be looking for, yeah? And it's just that we're going to seed the mind with some ideas of what this might be, what it might look for, where it might be coming from. But this morning, we're not really going to deal with treating papancha, yeah? As we're trying to see it as a symptom. It's built into the mind, yeah? Perceptions don't work by themselves. They need data to kind of build and collect upon. But knowing that, when we see our minds kind of reaching from one thought to the next, we can say, hey, look what it's doing. Yeah? That reaching, that going from one thought to the next is not the problem. It's the symptom of the mind trying to hold on to an idea, trying to develop an idea. And we're like, well, what is the idea it's trying to develop? And we find the mind is doing this because somebody said something and that person's a jerk. That person's always a jerk and the person's very insensitive. We find that, well, the mind is trying to develop this perception that the person is a jerk, which is actually hard to do, right? You got to keep feeding it with new evidence that the person is a jerk because they're just walking around, they're just breathing, they're just eating food. Most of the time they're not doing anything to oppress you. So you've got to keep reinforcing this idea with information. If you run out of information that says they're a jerk, you actually forget that they're a jerk. Yeah. And the mind is subtly kind of, it doesn't want to do that. It wants to hold on to this perception, yeah, as long as it can. So these things, these are hungry things. Yeah? These are needy things, these perceptions. And the Papañca Sañña Sankha, the building of perceptions, is this part of perceptions themselves that tries to reinforce themselves. Yeah? And it can be greed, hatred, or delusion. Yeah. So when we elaborate on our imaginary garden, we're just grabbing things. We have a beautiful idea, yeah, a fun, entertaining, delightful idea. And we're trying to reinforce for ourselves that this is a fun, delightful, entertaining idea, right? We're trying to bring in more interesting stuff because the mind is naturally, there's entropy. It's starting to get bored. It's starting to get distracted. So we keep reinforcing this. We're like, I want to keep thinking about this thing. If we catch ourselves doing this, we can trace it back. We're like, well, what is the thing I'm trying to develop? Oh, I'm trying to develop this beautiful idea. Oh, I'm trying to develop this grudge. Oh, I'm trying to develop this distraction so that I don't have to pay attention to X, Y, or Z that's happening outside. Yeah. So I don't have to pay attention to sitting here on a chair outside the winter wonderland. Yeah. And once we catch that, then we know what the disease is. Yeah. Which is part of the process of curing it. Right? As part of releasing the suffering of not knowing. So now, All of that's to give some context, because once we look at the suttas, we're immediately going to be just a whole bunch of like college level doctrinal ideas might land on us, but we're going to go for it anyway. Yeah. I've got two suttas. So the first one we'll take a look at is actually a very well-known, it's actually why this was recommended today, right? Is the Majjhima Nikaya 18, the Honey Cake Sutta, or the Ball of Honey Sutta. So named because the monks who heard it said, well, it's delightful and nourishing, like a sweet treat. And the Buddha said, well, that's how you can remember the sutta. And the sutta has, it starts out in a funny way, yeah? So we have a wanderer, Sakyan, his name is Dandapani. And if you know about the Pāli canon, you know that there are nicknames for people that they didn't bother remembering their actual name. And Dandapani means this guy has a stick in his hand. And that's his nickname. But the nickname is trying to describe the guy. And one can say that the guy probably is a fighter. He probably wanders around looking for a good argument to get his kicks. Yeah. And that's exactly what he does. He comes up to the Buddha and he says, what is the ascetic's doctrine? What does he assert? Yeah. So he's like, what's your viewpoint? Because he wants something to argue with. But the Buddhas. And he says, friend, my doctrine is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world with its gods, Mars, and Brahmas, its population with ascetics and Brahmins, its gods and humans. My doctrine is such that perceptions do not underlie a Brahmin who lives detached from sensual pleasures. They're without doubting, stripped of worry, and rid of craving for rebirth in this or that or any state. That is my doctrine. That is what I assert. Basically, he's saying, I teach a doctrine whereby you won't form opinions that allow you to get into arguments with people. And when the Buddha said this, Dandapani shook his head, wagged his tongue, raised his eyebrows until his brow puckered in 3 furrows, and he departed, leaning on that very stick. He wanted an argument, and he found the cessation of arguments. He realized he had nothing to argue with, and so he left. Okay, this guy's no fun. I'm going to go find somebody who wants to argue about the nature of the origin of the universe. Now, when the Buddha came out of retreat and he met the monks, he told them what had happened. And these monks are foils. They are examples of maybe ourselves. So we hear the word Papañca, yeah? And we say, oh, I got that. What about that? And so the monks ask him, what is this doctrine? Yeah, how is it that perceptions don't underlie the Buddha or Brahmin who lives detached from sensual pleasures? How could it be that you don't have perceptions, you don't have viewpoints, you don't have standpoints, you don't have opinions, you don't have, the source of these conflicts? And the Buddha says, mendicants, bhikkhus, judgments driven by papañca, sañña, sankha, judgments driven by proliferating perceptions beset a person. He's saying, look, yes, your mind is beset by this development of perceptions. But if this papañca doesn't find anything worth approving, welcoming, or getting attached to in the source from which this papañca arises, just then, this is the end of underlying tendencies to desire, repulsion, views, doubt, conceit, the desire to be reborn in ignorance. This is the end of taking up the rod and sword, the end of quarrels, arguments, disputes, accusations, divisive speech, and lies. This is where bad, unskillful qualities cease without anything left over. And that's what the Buddha said. And having spoken, he got up from his seat and entered his dwelling. And the monks were like, ah. you can imagine. They're like, yes, but how do we get rid of it? They're like, yes, we get, if there wasn't anything approving, welcoming, worth getting attached to, we might not be stuck with craving, but we find a lot of things worth getting attached to in the world. How do we stop this craving despite it? Now, why did the Buddha get up and walk away? Well, the commentaries would say because he knew that the monks were going to ask Mahakotthita, and this was a great time for another esteemed teacher to be able to shine. But as we find out, that teacher, was the first thing he said was, "Look, the Buddha's your teacher. What didn't you get?" But also, reading a little bit into it, the Buddha said something much more profound at the beginning of this statement. Yeah. He's saying that perceptions do not underlie the Buddha, the Brahman. He's saying that the Arahant doesn't have perception. Yeah. And that's a much more profound thing. He's saying that because they don't have, Papañca developing their perceptions, the perceptions have died out. So how is it that they see the world if not through the lens, through the viewpoint, through the perspective, through the opinions that they have of the world? Well, that's the thing. They just see the world. So the Buddha, that's the real surprising thing. Not that they don't have Papañca, but that they don't have the Saññas that the Papañca is trying to develop. But of course, we're much more concerned with the actual suffering that's being caused by our mind constantly chewing on these ideas. And so they want to know, well, what can we do with this Papañca that's happening, that's developing the perceptions? And what they do is they go find the Venerable Mahakotthita, who's one of the great disciples, and they say, well, he's esteemed by the Buddha, praised by everybody. Maybe he can explain this better. But they get to him and he says, Venerables, suppose there's a person who needed heartwood and they went wandering the forest until they came onto a large tree, but they'd pass over the roots and trunk and gather up the branches and leaves. Basically, they were there with the Buddha and he gave them an important teaching. They're interested in the minutia, in the little stuff around the sides. But of course, this is all in fun and games. He knows, they want to practice, they want to understand this just like we do. And so he elaborates a little. And the way that he elaborates is by linking this to consciousness, yeah? And this is what we'll see in the second sutta, is that Mahakotthita says that what the Buddha is basically saying is we've got this Papañca because there are things that are delightful, attractive, worth attaching to. We've got these things that we're being exposed to that are interesting to us. They help us develop our opinions. They help us develop our viewpoints. Because we encounter these things, our mind can grab them up. It can grab up sights. It can grab up sounds. It can grab up smells. It can grab up tastes. It can grab up tactile sensations. It can even grab up the thoughts running through our mind sense base, yeah? And it uses those to reinforce its perceptions of the world. But he says, eye consciousness arises dependent on eyes and sights. So we need to have an eye, and there needs to be things visible to have eye consciousness arise, for us to be able to say, look, there's a visible thing there. This meeting of the three, we call contact. Contact is the condition for feeling, and what you feel, you perceive. So in the Buddhist psychological cosmology, feeling and perception are kind of arising, stuck together, yeah? When we develop an opinion, we feel. We feel because of our opinion. Our viewpoint pulls us away from the thing and creates subject and object. And this allows us to feel a certain way about the thing we're perceiving. And he says, what you perceive, you think about, yeah? So we don't think randomly. We think about what we are encountering in the world, whether that be a sight, a sound, a smell, a flavor, a tactile sensation, or a thought. Even if our eyes are closed, we're sitting comfortably, we've forgotten our body completely, a thought will arise and we think about that thought. The thought makes us feel something. We perceive something about that thought. What you think about, you proliferate. So these are the same thing, yeah? We don't want to have just unconnected thoughts, we want our thoughts to build to something. So we keep stringing them together. What you proliferate is the source from which judgments driven by proliferating perceptions beset a person. So I don't know about you, but that means almost nothing to me. It's word soup. But it's basically saying that, yes, if you keep thinking about the same thing, this is what we talk about when we talk about proliferation. That's what it is. It's not something separate from the mind. You thinking is what we call proliferation when you're thinking along the same topic, yeah? And he goes through and he says, this is the way things are. And this is dependent origination, right? Okay. I'm just trying to figure out because a lot of this is elided. There we go. Then he reiterates what the Buddha said in a slightly more specific way. He says, when there is no I, no sights, no eye consciousness, it will not be possible to discover any evidence of eye contact. If you have no eyeball, you can't see. But now it's not saying if we just remove our eyeball, we won't have to worry about craving anymore. I would say it's still, you know, there's other sense bases, and just scouring ourselves of sense bases will remove the underlying craving for sense contact, right? But were we to remove that underlying craving, were we to allow the senses to go quiet because we're not craving for them to be there, we might have this experience where our eye consciousness actually, we're not attending to the eye, we're not attending to sights, we're not looking for things, so eye consciousness doesn't arise. And he's saying when there is no contact, it's not possible to discover any feeling because we have to see something to feel about it. Well, when there's no feeling, there's no perception. There's no perception, there's no feeling. When there's no feeling, there's no perception. When there's no perception, it's not possible to discover evidence of us thinking in order to develop that perception. And when we're not thinking to develop the perception, it's not possible to discover evidence of papancha. So it's profound and out there at the same time. It's saying, look, when you're not looking for things, when you're not seeing things, you're not developing papancha around the things that you're seeing. And this is what I mean by proliferation. It's not quite the best word, because when we're not seeing, we're not papanchaing about sights. Yeah. When it's just not there. It's not that it's off to the side and we're developing our papancha in a different thing and we're just filling the room with all of our papancha. It's ceased. We're only doing one thing at a time. Yeah. The revelation is that that's actually what's happening. That's not how we tend to think about things. We tend to think about things as existing, as being static, as being there. Yeah. Even when we're not attending to them, we tend to think that they're there. But the important thing to understand is when we're not attending to the eye consciousness is not there. It's ceased, it's gone. Yeah. So because it's gone, there's no basis for perception. And because there's no basis for perception, there can't be the papancha that's trying to develop that perception. And so our papancha is ceasing all the time based on this criteria. But that's not to say that, you know, we spend most of our time without papancha. It's really quite the opposite. Anytime that we've got perceptions going on, we've got perspectives about the world, we're feeling things, we can pretty much assume that the tendency of the mind is going to be, hey, let's run with that, let's develop that, hey, let's think about that some more. So he's saying it's built into the mind, but it's also stuck in the mind. It's part of the mind. If that part of the mind stops working, then this papancha stops working. And he goes on for the other sense bases, and the end of the sutta is the monks go back to the Buddha and relate what he said. And the Buddha said, he's wise. Yeah, listen to him. You know, he explained it in a really good way. And that's the end of the honey cake sutta. Yeah, that's the essence of the honey cake sutta, dealing with Papañca and the end of Papañca. If you have, I think this is a great resource, which I know many of you have, Bhikkhu Bodhi's collections of the Nikayas by Wisdom Publications. This has, there's all sorts of appendices in the back. So you can use this to look up concepts like Papañca. And if you do that, it'll give you a list of all the suttas that this arises in. And you'll see that Papañca does not have a ton of references, but this is one way that you can find a sutta absolutely buried in the Numbered Discourses, Book of the Fours. This is Book of the Fours, number 173, with Mahakotthita. And this is a part of a pair where the Venerable Sariputta and the Venerable Mahakotthita, who are both other great disciples, are chatting about Dhamma, as great disciples frequently did. And Mahakotthita is not yet fully enlightened. He's just realized that the person staying with him is actually the great disciple, the Venerable Sariputta. And so they chat and they bounce some ideas off of each other and delight in the explanations. And Mahakotthita says, when the six fields of contact, that is our six senses, have faded away and ceased, just like in the last sutta, with nothing left over, does something still exist? And Venerable Sariputta says, don't put it like that. Well, I say, well, what do you mean? Does something else no longer exist? He says, does nothing exist? He says, well, don't put it like that. He says, well, does something both exist and not exist? And I don't even know how that's possible, but this is a very common thing in Indian philosophy. And he says, don't put it like that. And then Mahakotthita says, does something neither exist nor not exist? And he says, well, Sariputta says, don't put it like that. And Mahakotthita says, well, look, I'm asking a pretty straightforward question. When the six sense bases cease, is there anything there? And you keep saying, don't put it like that. Why? How should I take the meaning of this statement? Like, how does your mind work, Venerable? That's what he's trying. That's the real crux of the matter. It's like, how does an arahant think? I'm trying to figure out, like, what's there when my thought stops? What's there in the gap? Is there something there? Is there not something there? Is there something and not something there? And Sariputta responds, if you say, when the sixth field of contact have faded away and ceased with nothing left over, something still exists, you're proliferating about the unproliferated. See, he's saying you have Papañca. You're trying to find sense data in the place where there is no sense data. So your Papañca is trying to grab something in the space where there isn't anything because your sense bases have ceased. Now this is, it's fairly esoteric, but he's saying the same thing that the Buddha and Mahakotthita said in the previous sutta. He's saying that Papañca really should stop when the sense bases stop. They are part of the development of perception. So if perceptions themselves are not valid because there's nothing to perceive, then the Papañca should stop. And what's happening is, I said greed, hatred, or delusion, yeah? So we can have a greedy Papañca, we can have hateful Papañca, we can have deluded Papañca, and this is the third category. Mahakotthita is kind of, he's trying to find stuff in the place where there is no stuff to find. And it's not that we're saying there are no dhammas, but he's using the part of his mind that's looking for sense data to look in the place where the senses have ceased. It should not be a valid pursuit. It's a deluded thing to do. And Venerable Sariputta is saying, well, look, even the fact that you're asking that question is the symptom of the problem, yeah? It's showing you that you have delusion, and he's trying to wake his friend up. And in the afternoon, we're going to look at another example of somebody who does not have papancha, pointing out papancha to somebody who does have it and doesn't realize that they have it. And this is one of those examples. The Venerable Sariputta is saying, hey, forget about that question you just asked, and look, what are you doing? You're doing papancha. That is the suffering here. That is the symptom of why you're searching in the first place. But he wraps it up is saying the scope of proliferation extends as far as the scope of the 6 fields of contact. The scope of the 6 fields of contact, 6 sense bases, extends as far as the scope of proliferation. When the 6 sense bases fade away and cease with nothing left over, proliferation stops. It is stilled. It no longer exists. So we don't have to worry that when our mind goes quiet in meditation, we don't have to worry when the sense bases have gone quiet, that proliferation is still there, that we're still susceptible to it. It ceased too. And if we try to put it there, what we're doing is bringing it back in a search for dhammas to latch onto. And that is papancha itself. Yeah. But to recognize that when the 6 senses go quiet, then papancha has also gone quiet. We don't have to look for it because it's just simply not there. Okay, I warned you ahead of time. That is the Pāli canon. That is the minds of the great arahants, trying to explain to us something that is out there. But now we're going to look into our own minds, which are way more straightforward, way more simple in their pursuits. Yeah. We're gonna begin meditation. Again, the schedule is, as it always is, whatever works for you. We'll have until noon Eastern time, so 2 hours. And you divide that up how you want. And I strongly suggest trying something like on the half hour, check in with yourself and say, do I want to sit? Do I want to walk? It doesn't matter if you're sitting or you're walking, just ask yourself what works. Yeah. And so you kind of have a timer and you kind of don't. You're kind of feeling it out and work with what comes up. But this is the theme. You can take it or you can just follow the breath. Do whatever you want. Yeah. Whatever works for you. But since we got this theme going, and then since you got this bank of brains working on the same problem, you maybe tap into that energy. You know that there's these other practitioners out there who are watching for papancha, yeah, ready to catch it, ready to spring on it when they see it in action, and tap into that energy, yeah? So what you're looking for is an idea is attractive, an idea is interesting, an idea seems worth attaching to. That is a really good grudge. I think I want to hold on to it and develop it against that so-and-so, yeah? And catch your mind dwelling in that space and see how it reaches out for data, for that thing that the person said, that way that the person cocked their head, or the way that people reacted when the person came in the room, and see how it's trying to gather evidence to develop this nebulous idea that you've got. And you would say, you are papancha. And now the real interesting thing is treating it like, okay, my hand is turning blue. Yeah. Don't try to stop the papancha because you don't need to. Yeah. Just catching it and recognizing that it is coming because of the thing that you're trying to delight in is the solution there. Yeah. The problem is not the papancha. The problem is the thing that you're delighting in. And if you can deal with that delight, that attachment, that fixation, then the papancha will stop on its own. Yeah. It is dependent on that fixation. So that's what we look for. And we're using it and developing the sense that it is our little warning light. beep, 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 you're deluded. Calm down. Calm down, you're deluded. Calm down. It sounds like a good idea, but it's really not a good idea. Yeah. And we'll see what we get. Yeah. This is all right. I'll turn it away to you. Let's begin meditation.